Urban planning content is kind of everywhere now, and its rise is sort of fascinating to me. See, my partner's grandpa was a town planner, and when we went to visit him, he'd occasionally point out something in his local town that he'd helped design. I specifically remember him pulling into the car park of a Harvester pub once, and him being like, "I drew this. This was me." Which was interesting, and pretty charming. But I never remember thinking it was cool in the conventional sense. Being a town planner was, in my mind, and I assumed in most other people's, a kind of nerdy, maybe occasionally dull office job. But over the past few years, that seems to have changed significantly. Suddenly, I can't move on YouTube or TikTok or Twitter without being served some kind of urban planning or public transport content. And people seem to not only find this content interesting or intellectually stimulating, but cool. Urban planning is cool now. For quite some time, I've been keen to try and explore why this shift came about. And in order to do so, there was really only one person to speak to. The orange urbanist himself, Jason from Not Just
Jason,
Bikes.
welcome to the show. Thank you so much for agreeing to give up a little bit of your evening to me.
Yeah, no problem. Anything, anytime, Tom. It's great.
That was a big promise.
I'm happy to come on, man. I'm a big fan of your videos. I actually watch them all, and that's not true of most Nebula creators. So or most creators in general, right? I don't watch that much stuff, but I've always found your stuff enjoyable.
Oh, thank you. Oh, that's always really nice. And the adoration is returned. I really I mean, as we'll come across in the course of this podcast, I'm sure really enjoy, as many people do, which is sort of the thing we're here to discuss a little bit. That Not Just Bikes has, I think, is it your fan base describes it as being orange pilled? Am I correct?
They describe it as being orange pilled. That once they've watched my content, they can never see their cities the same way again, which can be
Yeah.
a good thing or a bad thing, depending on who you ask.
In fact, this was so I know we've had this chat kind of set up for a few weeks now, but
Yeah.
I was really sort of, over the last week, as it was on my calendar coming towards me. I was thinking about it, partly because so I was in New York doing some work for Nebula, the fantastic video platform we are
I'm
both
familiar with
part
it.
of, and I'd been to New York once before, maybe, and I think I worked out it was 2014 because me and
Right.
my partner had watched Birdman and had come out of the cinema and been just sort of easily swayed children had been like, "Oh, that place was cool. We should go to that. We should go to that place." That's that
Nice.
they seem like good buildings.
Nice.
Um, and I think when we were there that time, uh, I must have realized that being in New York involved crossing the road quite a lot because it's this sort of grid city. So you
Yeah.
sort of walk for 5 minutes, you stop for a while, you walk for 5 minutes, and you stop for a while. So, and I think I must have noticed that when we were there last time, but this time I really noticed it in a way that and sort of in a way of being able to think about it in a kind of contextualized way as a
Right.
kind of, I guess, what I'd call a kind of political issue, in terms of it's a question of how do we shape the spaces in which we
Right.
exist and stuff.
And is it reasonable that I need to stop and wait this much in New York City when there's like 10 times as many people on the sidewalk as there are in cars?
Yeah, and who is it that has these? Who is it that is driving? And some of these are business vehicles where you go, okay,
Yep.
you need to get. I think I was staying in a kind of flower district, and sometimes you need to get flowers from one place to another in
Yep.
a van, and that kind of makes sense. Sometimes you've got a big hulking great SUV with dark windows, where it's probably just someone wants to get from A to B a little bit quicker than they would be able to on the metro or
Right.
walking, partly because of the the fact you have to cross the road all the time. Um,
Yes, the number of lights you need to wait for.
yeah, which is a lot, and also just I always find it interesting going to different countries. The fact that everything is like almost similar but not quite. So you have what is essentially a zebra crossing in the UK.
Yeah.
but for some reason all the cars can turn right at you, and that suddenly there's like, oh wow, okay, I don't sort of have
Yeah.
right of way.
Yeah, I mean, I've talked about that before. Right on red is bonkers. You know, it's really funny. When I when I talk about the history of the Netherlands, the oil crisis in the 1970s hit a
Mm,
lot of countries, and it caused a lot of terrible effects all over the place. In the Netherlands, it helped to kick off a lot of the changes that happened to make it a cycling country. And the United States, the only lasting thing they got out of the oil crisis was turning right on red. So they had implemented that during the oil crisis to save on gasoline so that cars didn't need to idle at a red light when turning right.
oh
Yeah.
really?
And it's still there today and it kills a ridiculous number of people. Like I shouldn't even be laughing about it, except that it's so ridiculous that it's still around given how many people get killed
Yeah.
when turning right on red. It's absurd, but trying to get rid of it is damn near impossible. I
I
know
think
it's been tried.
for me, it was a time when I was crossing and there was like 2 lanes coming round. So sort of one I could keep an eye
Right.
on, I could work that out.
Right.
But then when there was like another car coming, and because they're these big hulking great SUV things,
Yeah.
like the car you sort of don't see the next one come round, and you're
Yeah.
suddenly like, I don't know, you suddenly feel like it's sort of massive elephants you're around to be stampeded by, and you're sort of like, thank you very much, thank
That's one of
you.
those things you see very often in the United States that when you do have zebra crossings, you and I will pronounce that the British way because I did live in the UK for 6 years. It is zebra crossing.
Thank you.
It's actually funny. I lived in the UK and worked for a British company, and they really beat me down on a lot of my pronunciations of words. Like I will say aluminium. But anyway,
You've
one
just
of the
been
problems
worn
you
down.
it really was worn down. And I remember the first time I said that I'll put it in my diary instead of calendar, I was like, I need to leave. I can't do this anymore.
I th
Anyway,
I feel like that's not the worst. I feel like I would understand what someone said by that. That's not the it's not one of the, like, weird ones, holding down the fort or could care less. Some of those where it really sort of
well, I don't know. A diary in North America is something that only a little girl would write in. So yeah.
yeah, it's your dear
So
diary
it
rather
makes
than
no sense whatsoever to North Americans to say, I'll put it in my diary. And I was like, that was one I was really trying not to do. But anyway, the point I was trying to make here before I got horribly distracted is that in the US, a lot of the problem with the zebra crossings is you have to cross multiple lanes of traffic, and there's no like refuge island in the center, which is quite common in the UK too,
mm,
to have that little island. You cross a
yeah.
lane or two, and then there's that little island you wait at. That's very rare in the United States. And so you get these situations where you have to cross 5, 6, 7 lanes of car traffic on a zebra crossing. And it's ridiculously dangerous.
Yeah, I think it was I think what really struck me was the way in which I was thinking about it. Is that before I would have gone, oh, there's a lot of cars here. I'm just in a
Yeah.
big city,
Yeah.
sort of
And
fact
this is
of
just the
life
way it
kind of
is, right?
thing.
Yeah.
And maybe that's that I don't live in the biggest city in the world. So
What part of the UK do you live in?
so I live in a city called Plymouth, which is in
Yeah.
like the southwest. So that's the
Yep.
pointy little bit down the bottom. So it's not a huge city. It's fairly car centric in that the public transport isn't amazing, but it's not so big that that completely takes everything over.
But you'll still have your local high street and things like that, right? Like
Yeah, in fact, the one that's near me is the sort of closest kind of, or well, closest by one maybe high street. Is a kind of interesting. I've thought sort of using the terminology that you use, which I think you sort of borrow from strong towns of your strode.
yes.
Um, we sort of do. It's not so it's not quite as big. It's
Yeah.
not. It's only 2 lanes either side.
Yeah.
But we do have a street where it has shops either side and sort of seems like and always seems like it's going to be the cool street with lots of little shops and sort of sometimes gets sort of half the way there,
Right.
but then has like a sort of central reservation with barriers up because it's very much a kind of thoroughfare for traffic, and
Right.
it would be really tempting just to run across the road, and I'm sure it's one of those barriers where you feel like there's probably a story behind
Yeah, it's
the
probably there for a
reason
reason.
there's probably quite a dark story behind why that barrier is there. But it sort of does okay, I think. And so to go to a big American city, there's always going to be a leap. But I think it was really interesting the fact that there has been such an explosion in discussions around urban environments that suddenly meant that I was looking at it in this really connected way of
Right.
going, oh, that this isn't sort of the way that, and I guess I don't have the same ownership over New York to be really like, oh no, I really feel really sorry for Fourth Avenue or wherever I was. No, the avenues are the smaller ones that go. I don't know. To be like, oh, I really wish.
I don't remember. Avenues are one way, streets are the other. I don't remember. I've been to New York many times, but I don't know.
I wasn't there going like, oh, I feel so sorry for Broadway that it's not fully pedestrianized. But I was going, oh, isn't it interesting that these choices have been made to
Yes.
make this place, which, I mean, is in many ways quite traversable without any kind of car. You
Yeah,
can,
and
I
New
mean,
York City is the weird exception in the United States. Like whenever you see any graphs of anything related to urban planning, there'll be all of the cities here and then a big spike for New York because it's so different in every way to every other city in the country. But it's still a place that oh man, it's a place that disappoints me so much because you never know that 70%, I think it's a little more than 70% these days of households in Manhattan do not own a car. But you
mm,
never know it by the number of cars that are there.
yeah.
It's shocking. Yeah, it's a strange place uh, when compared to other world cities of its size. Like if you compared it to London or Paris or Hong Kong or something like that. But it's also strange in the United States too, in that there's really no other city in the United States that's anything close to New York, especially Manhattan.
I did actually go. I went on the Sunday. I went outside of New York to a town called New Rochelle, which is just sort of to the north,
Mhm.
to go to a very tiny museum. And I asked someone like how to, because it's about half an hour walk to get there. And he was just like, "There's the taxis,"
Yeah, right.
and like he was like, "Oh, you get a cab there," and I was like, it's a nice day. I don't want to spend 25-30 dollars on cabs getting there and back. I'd have a nice walk through because I could see some of it was through a park.
Right.
And so I think there is a particularly maybe a American cultural thing around cars, but I don't think it is uh just there. Like I definitely feel it in the UK.
Yeah.
Um
It's very different in the UK, but it's still an element that's there. I mean, this is one of these things that permeates all over the world, right? I think,
mm,
I mean, cars are really useful, so
yeah,
of course
yeah,
you're going
yeah.
to use them. And as you talked about, there'd be the flower trucks and all that kind of thing. I mean, motor vehicles are incredibly useful, but I do kind of feel like in the 20th century went a little overboard with it. We had this new technology called cars, and we're like, oh my
Mm,
god, this is the best thing ever. Let's put them everywhere. Let's have everyone drive them all the time. We don't need anything else. And I kind of feel like we just went too far with that logic. And now we need to
yeah.
reel it back in a little bit to say, okay, this is a really useful technology we have here, but let's use it in moderation, like where it's useful, because it's like literally killing us too, right? So,
Mm,
yeah, but everywhere in the world, of course, it's so easy for a city to get overrun by automobiles because it's one of these things that I've talked about before, where on an individual basis, it can be really, really great. You're sitting in
mm,
your own little private metal box. You can go wherever you want, whenever you want. But on a societal basis, when everybody's in cars, it has a lot of negatives, and I think
mm.
it's that kind of balance between the personal benefits and the societal costs that really causes a lot of the issues there fundamentally.
I'm lucky in that I do most of my work from home and then do sort of a day or two where I'm not at home, where I mostly cycle to places.
Right.
And so when I do, so me and my partner share a car, which she mostly uses because she needs to get to work in it.
Yep.
And the very few times where I have to drive and I'm driving at a time when it is like rush hour or whatever, I do find it really odd because like we've got a not particularly nice car. It's also not particularly eco-friendly, but it's yeah, it gets us around, but it doesn't have a fancy entertainment system or anything.
Right.
And it's those times where I go, oh, this is why some of my friends are like, no, I need a really great radio, and I need it to not have windscreen wipers that hit against the side and go like clack, clack, clack. Where I'm like, oh, this is fine. And I'm like, oh no, because you're sat in it for
Yeah, you're going to be trapped in
all
it
the
for hours
time.
and hours and hours at a time. So it had better be nice. Yeah.
Um, but it does feel like there is a I think backlash is not the right word, maybe, because that feels sort of a bit more angry in a kind of rage filled way. But it does feel like there is a sort of questioning. And I know you were saying before we came on that for you it's maybe hard to tell to what extent that has permeated to wider society because you're sort of at the heart of
Yeah, I'm like literally
questioning.
in the middle of it, and a lot of it is literally orbiting around me and my channel. So I,
Yeah.
it's like I can't see in any direction I look. It's urban planning.
I mean, okay, I can't think of a less sort of aggrandizing comparison than this, but I feel like it's a bit like this is very flattering. Jesus must have been like, whoa, everyone's suddenly talking about this Christianity thing. Everyone's so
You
I
know, it's
don't know
quite
what
funny
I'm,
because
I'm
there's a bit of a cult that's that's happened around the channel too, especially if you go over to the subreddit "fuck cars,"
yeah, yeah.
which was not started by me, but the people who started it are fans of the channel. Like it's got some of the flair there is not just bikes and orange pilled and stuff like that in it, and people over there have made the joke before that I'm the Messiah, and there's these Life of Brian memes that have been photoshopped with my head on it, where they're in there, the Messiah, and I'm like, and it's like Photoshop Life of Brian with my head on it that says I'm not the Messiah, and then it's like only the Messiah would say he's not the Messiah.
Oh,
So
I don't. I don't think I could cope with that. I think I've talked previously about the fact that I quite like. I don't know. I often don't feel a huge amount of pressure before one of my videos comes out. I
right,
don't think I don't know. Like I like to make them good. I like to make them as good as I can.
right.
But I don't. I tend to feel like if one of my videos is bad, it just doesn't get no one watches it. And I sort of don't mind that. I would sort of prefer that to be the system. That if I make something and it's not good, it's just gets
Nobody
lost
watches it and
to
they all forget
time.
about it, and that's the end of
Yeah,
it, right? Yeah.
I'm okay with that. I don't think I could deal with uh with everyone being like the Messiah is about to release a new is about to descend from
Oh my
wherever
god.
the mountain that I just think he goes up a mountain at some point. I can't remember. Um,
I would like to think that it's really not quite that bad, but there definitely is. It is kind of crazy how much that my channel has grown. And I don't really know why that is. I don't know if my channel struck a nerve or whether it was just good timing because I started the channel in October of 2019 and
mhm.
it hit 100,000 subscribers in about 13 months, I think it was, which is very fast, right?
Yeah, yeah.
But at the same time, that was right before COVID hit and the lockdowns hit, right?
Mm,
And so I think part of this urban planning thing, I think, is due to the coronavirus lockdowns because what happened is that pretty much every city in the world suddenly had a lot fewer cars on the road.
mm,
And so no matter where you were, you're suddenly looking at like 1/10 the number of cars on the road because people weren't going to work and they weren't going out. They certainly weren't doing, leisure trips and things like that. And I think people, with a lot of the shops being closed and things like that, people were out on the streets more often, and
mm.
they started looking around and going like, "Wow, it's a lot nicer here now that there's a lot fewer of these cars around. It's quieter and it's a lot more pleasant to cross the street, and it's easier to get around." And people started, for example, bicycles became like sold out around the world during
Yeah.
the coronavirus lockdown, and the bicycle manufacturers were having trouble getting parts and getting bicycles into shops and stuff like that because there was such a huge spike in demand for bicycles. And I think again, that's because people, well, maybe they didn't want to take public transit and so they decided to take a bicycle, but I think it's also an element that when there's fewer cars on the road, people feel safer
Mm,
cycling. And I've seen this all over cities in Europe too, even outside of the coronavirus. That in general, the cities that have lower car volumes and lower speeds have more people who ride bicycles. infrastructure or not, they feel safer out there, and that's usually the thing that holds back cycling in anywhere in the world.
Yeah, I know. I started. Well, I'd sort of been through had a few periods in my life where I'd done quite a lot of running, and sort of done it for a while and sort of stopped. I think maybe twice I'd had like sort of maybe a year where I sort of ran quite a lot for a year, and then it came to winter and the days got shorter, and I didn't want to run on Christmas Day, and then that sort of went away for a couple of years. But over the last like maybe 2 or 3 years now, I've been running quite a lot, and that was during COVID that I started that, because suddenly exercise was a thing that excuse me, exercise was a thing that I had to actively go actively go, I'm going to do this on this particular time of the day, because I'm not going to, because walking up and down the stairs isn't gonna
Yeah, that's not going to cut it
in the
anymore.
same way that previously I might have gone to the shop a lot more in the week, because
Right,
I like just going to the shop and browsing around the supermarket. Um, and it has meant that I've spent a lot more time sort of. I've always been. I've rarely been someone who's driven all the time, so I've often been someone who's walked and cycled, and got around that way. But it has meant that the city I live in is sort of kind of the place I hang out in some ways. Like
right,
as much as if I was uh, playing on the PlayStation for an hour in my living room, instead I'm going on an hour's run. Essentially, I'm kind of just hanging around in the
right,
city, and so you do suddenly notice you notice things in a slightly different way about how the space is planned, and how like I know all the different ways that I can run and try and avoid crossing too many roads, because I don't want to
right,
have to stop lots,
right.
and you start to really notice how things um shift together. So I imagine there's probably lots of people who um started off doing that, and then suddenly, oh, there's more cars coming back, and you're suddenly going, oh,
Yeah,
this
and
is
people started to see it. So they experienced it with fewer cars, and then the cars
mm,
started coming back, and then they're like, "This kind of sucks now. I
yeah,
wonder
yeah.
why that is." And they pop on the internet, and suddenly there's this orange branded channel telling them, "Hey, here's the reason why it sucks so much."
Is the hoodie you're wearing, is that a for anyone that's listening to the audio version, Jason is wearing a fabulous orange hoodie.
Yes.
Is this branded? Is
It
this
is not branded, actually. This was one I went back to Canada last summer, and my mother got me this orange hoodie. She's like, she saw it and she was like, "This is the orange. This is NJB orange." So
oh, oh, that doesn't I'm glad I asked. That was really
I,
helpful.
I I got the I got the branded mug, but well, this is the branded mug that says Nachos Bikes. But
Yeah,
anyway,
which is your Mr. Beast burger
yeah, I
can
guess so,
be
right?
can be
I got to start a Mexican restaurant.
But that's interesting, because that's sort of a similar place to where you were coming from when you started the channel. Is although rather than it being walking around your city without cars
Yep.
and the cars coming back, more of a kind of geographical
Yeah.
comparison, which has been really interesting. I don't know if this has been increasingly. I think I was particularly thinking about it while watching the video you did with Foreign Man, Foreign Land,
Oh, yeah.
um, about uh, the Bahamas, and thinking about it's really interesting. You going to different places has been a really. I'm sort of being like, how does this work? What can we learn? What can we um, because those kind of geographical comparisons, I think, are really interesting.
Yeah, and I'm hoping to do more of those over the coming years now that travel is freed up some more. It's a little bit difficult for me to travel because I do
Mm,
have two kids, have a family and
yeah.
everything. But I've been trying to make opportunities to travel. I've been out to Paris and I've been to Switzerland and Italy, around Italy with high speed trains. And I was just recently in Oslo, and I'm working on those videos right now. And I find it really is interesting to go to all these different cities and see what they're doing well and what they could be doing
Mm,
better. And I think there are examples there that are really interesting. I found Oslo to be fascinating. They've basically solved car traffic. Like car traffic's
mm.
gone now, and it certainly wasn't even when I was there 5 years ago. So it's amazing to see these cities and how they're changing. I
I
think there's
have
a lot of
a
really interesting things happening in Europe in particular.
I have a horrific public transport in Oslo story
Oh yeah,
of maybe horrific's overselling it. Of I When I was there, I got one tram, I think, in my entire trip, because one day I'd been working there most of the time, and I had a day off, and I was like, I'm going to see as many sites as possible, and I got
Yep.
one of those kind of tickets you get in lots of cities where you can get entry to lots of different museums, and you also get free
Right.
transport on the buses and trams, etc., for the day.
Right.
It was getting towards the end of the day, and lots of stuff had closed because it was kind of autumn, I think, and so it gets dark at about 3 o'clock. So most places close by 5 because no one wants to be out and about. Or at least the museums and stuff did. And the only place that was open was a kind of reptile zoo kind of thing, which when I got there was a very small building with just like sort of a gecko there and a snake there. It was very much me just being like, well, I've paid 40 euros or whatever for this.
I'm gonna
40,
see every
I was like,
damn museum.
and I've got an hour and I can get that one in, so I'm going. And I was on this tram back from it, being like, oh, that was, that was something, I guess. And I was trying to work out where my stop was, and I was there for ages, and I couldn't work out. It's another one of those things of being in a slightly different country and not being entirely certain how the system works. And they had a kind of what I assumed was a stop button, and I was like, well, I hope it's not like an emergency alarm button. So I got up and I sort of pressed it really gently, and that didn't do anything. And I was like, because I think I was just being too timid, because I was worried it was the I'm having an emergency.
Yeah, right.
So then I got the second time and I pushed it, and it did go bing, and it came up with something that I was like, okay, I'm pretty sure that's stop. That's okay. And then I went to sit back down, and it was one of those seats that just does the flip up when you
Yeah, they have a lot of those in Norway for some reason. The flip up seats. Yeah.
Crash to the floor, and I was just like, this is like last year as well, so I'm like a grown man. I'm not like 14 or something and get away with it. I cannot come back to this city.
I'm sorry. That's it. That's it. You're done.
But it is quite, because some of their transport stuff has been quite car centric in that it's been about electric cars, hasn't it? In Norway, that they've sort of used the oil money to subsidize. I think you can essentially just get an electric car really, really cheap, I think is the.
Yeah, I mean, Norway in general was built to be a bit car centric through the early 20th century because they were an oil power and they were happy to like have cheap oil and have lots of cars, and that seemed like the future. I think every place did that in the 60s, but any place that had oil certainly did that in the 60s. And then as it became clear that that internal combustion engines were not a good idea, they pushed hard over to electric cars, and with lots of steep discounts and everything, to the point where it's actually crazy how many cars in Norway are electric. Like you just going around the streets of Oslo, and it's all electric cars everywhere, and electric cars brands I've never seen, never heard of. And it's really interesting. But what I have found interesting about Norway is that over the past few years they've kind of let up on the electric car thing, and they've had this public acknowledgement that actually probably better to have a lot of these people in public transit than to have them all in electric cars. And so they've been actually ramping that down a little bit and bringing up public transit, which has been really interesting to see.
Because I think it's sort of, because it is quite a rural country, so there's
in parts,
that makes, if up in the north, that probably makes a lot of, like, I grew up in the countryside, and there was, it could have been connected. The buses sort of gradually got cut down to the point where I think there was like one a day into the major metropolis where I now live. But so I think there is places but particularly somewhere like Oslo where it is quite. It's not even actually that big, is it, as a city?
Not particularly, although it's not particularly high density either. It's a little bit I'd have to check the numbers, but it certainly doesn't feel like an extremely high density city, and it does go out and sprawl a little bit. But I find that the sprawl in Oslo is not so much car dependent sprawl. It's very much built around transit. So it goes out. There's all these little towns and stuff out as you go out and out of the city, but they're all connected by a metro line. They're all connected by a rail line. And then they've got, the little town around the rail station. And again, that seems to work quite well for them when it comes to reducing the amount of traffic in the capital.
Hey, I hope you're enjoying my chat with Jason. If you are, and you want to get your hands on more episodes of Induction, then you might like to know that every single episode of the show is released a full 2 weeks early on my streaming service, Nebula. Perhaps you've already heard a little bit about Nebula already. It's a premium streaming service built by a bunch of educational and education-adjacent creators. Philosophy Tube, Innuendo Studios, Jacob Geller, and, well, me. Alongside being completely ad-free, Nebula is packed with an ever-expanding library of early access and exclusive content from your favourite creators. A particular favourite of mine at the moment is Jetlag, a globe-trotting game show from the team behind Wendover Productions and Half as Interesting, in which contestants race across the world to various far-flung locations and perform all kind of challenges along the way. And, as I mentioned, both the audio and video versions of every single episode of Induction appear on Nebula a full fortnight earlier than on YouTube or Apple Podcasts or Spotify or wherever you currently get this show. If you want to find out a little bit more about Nebula, then I'd be super grateful if you do so by using our personalised link go.nebula.tv/induction. Using that link will ensure that you get the absolute best deal on Nebula at any given time, which at the moment is just $2.50 a month. It will also send some money our way to help us fund future episodes of Induction and main channel videos too. That link again is go.nebula.tv/induction. Now, back to my chat with Jason. What has been, out of as you've been travelling with this sort of eye to it, does Amsterdam remain your kind of gold standard for...
The funny thing is that we moved to Amsterdam. I mean, I won't go through the whole origin story, but we had lived in a bunch of different countries. We lived in the UK and Taiwan and Belgium. I had lived in the United States and California as well, and all over Canada. And we had moved back to Canada. And after living in all these nice walkable places, it wasn't doing it for me. We tried to live as like European as possible, to live like in an older neighborhood that still had some remnants of a high street, that still had streetcars and stuff like that. But it was not the same. There's just still, there's that you can tell the influence of car dependency. It comes into every city in Canada, and it's kind of inescapable. So we were looking at the sort of next place to live, but it had to be the last place. So we did a bunch of research. We had been all over the place. We had been to every major city that you could imagine. But we ended up in Amsterdam because of some of that research, to say, like, where did we want to raise our kids? Where did we want to stay for the rest of our lives, right? But Amsterdam wasn't the only city we were looking at. Like, I was looking at other cities in Copenhagen and Oslo and Stockholm and lots of different places. But we did settle on Amsterdam. I'm not even necessarily convinced that Amsterdam's the best city in the Netherlands. Like, I really liked Utrecht. If you like smaller cities, I really enjoyed Delft and Leiden. I think there's a lot of great places here. So I don't know. Amsterdam is a fantastic city. It really, really is. And of course, in the Netherlands, the bike infrastructure is second to none. There is nowhere in the world that comes anywhere close to the cycling infrastructure in the Netherlands, not only in its quality, but in its pervasiveness. It's everywhere throughout the entire country. Like, I can take a train out to some tiny little village and get out and get a rental bike there. And I know that it'll be safe to cycle around anywhere I go. So it's remarkable in that way. But I think that, I certainly don't think that the Netherlands has a monopoly on great cities. Certainly not in Europe. And like I said, I was really impressed with Oslo. I've been impressed with lots of different places here. I was really impressed with the quality of the public transportation in Berlin, for example, when I was there a few weeks ago, or a few months ago, I guess it is now. So yeah, I think I mean, my channel obviously talks about Amsterdam a lot because that's where we live. But I don't think that it's necessarily like the greatest city in the world or something like that. I think there's lots of European cities that are up there, and I think it would be even tough to say which one's the best. I mean, for example, the public transportation in Amsterdam is good, but it's not as good as other places in Europe. And I think part of the reason for that is because the cycling is so good, that actually cuts into the public transportation a bit too. So it's a complex thing, and it really depends, like, which slice you're looking for, what's important to you in a city.
I think what's always interesting about Europe as well is the ways in which the kind of slightly more macro level of how you can get between cities as well. I think earlier, maybe 6 months ago, maybe a little bit more, a little bit less,
my partner went to Lille. Was it Lyon? I can't remember. Went to France in the south, um, and uh, and decided to get the train rather than fly. And getting into France was a bit of a ordeal because the UK's trains are not completely, but quite oft, but largely on a kind of hub and spoke kind of thing. If you go to London and then you
Yeah.
go out
Yeah.
to wherever you need to go to, there is sort of deviations to that, but there is. If you want to get between two big cities, often you do have to go to, well, definitely from where we are, you often have to go into London and then sort of back
Right.
out. And so she had to go up to London to then sort of go back a little bit to get on the Eurostar. But then once she was in France, when she got to I guess it was Gare du Nord, I think
Yeah. Gare du Nord in Paris. Yeah.
uh, like after that, the trains were like quicker and like so much cheaper than it had been to sort of get to London. And the whole system just sort of worked for being able to cross huge amounts of the country.
Yeah.
Um, and also it's such a great way to travel distances, I think.
Oh, it really is. I mean, I love trains. That
Mm,
is just, I absolutely love trains. And they can be a pain in the ass sometimes in Europe, especially going between countries. And if this service doesn't talk to that one, if one train is late, and then you have to deal with the next service, and it's certainly not perfect, but wow, like train travel can just be so wonderful at times,
mm,
especially compared to airline travel, which I did a lot of because I used to work a job where I was traveling more or less constantly. And I've done more plane travel than anybody should ever do in a lifetime. And I'd be happy to never set foot on a plane again. Unfortunately, there's no trains to Canada, so I do have to do it sometimes still. But man, I will take a train over a plane every single time it's possible. Like when we went to Switzerland, for example, we took the night train, and
mm,
it's just so great. I
yeah.
mean, it's just so much nicer to just, you take public transit, or in our case, maybe we cycle to the train station, and then, you get on a train, it's nice and comfortable. There isn't all that nonsense with security. There isn't even the nonsense with like, put your tray tables up and prepare for takeoff and all this stuff and all the tiny seats, and it's comfortable and you can get up and walk around. There's a bar car, and like, it's just so nice to take the train. You can look out the window. You can continue using your mobile devices because you get service the whole way. It's just nice.
I want to do. No, I definitely when I was watching it was the Switzerland one, wasn't it? Where you had
Yeah.
the trains with those gorgeous views.
Yeah.
I
They are stunning.
really, I
And the
really
funny
want to
thing
do more
was,
train holidays because they are.
we we did the Glacier Express, and that video is on Nebula. So you also might have seen that one, but it's only on Nebula. About the Glacier Express train that goes from Zermatt to Saint Moritz, and it's really nice with the glass and everything. And they do a whole meal and all this stuff. But the thing is, like, even some of the local trains there are just really nice trains with big
Yeah.
windows, and it's just a local train. But it's gorgeous. You sit there in a comfortable seat with this like stunning window that like overlaps a bit on the roof of the train, and you can see all the mountains and the snow, and it's like why would I travel any other way? This is
Mm.
so civilized.
Someone's just thought about that slightly differently and just gone
Yeah,
like, what if this was nice?
right.
What if
That's
this
the
was
thing.
like a
What if it
really,
was nice?
which sometimes backfire. So we've got so the train line in southwest England, the Great Western Railway, was built by Isambard Kingdom Brunel in whenever,
The man, the man
1923.
himself.
Um, and there is a bit where it goes. So he didn't want it to go across the moors because, uh, for whatever reason, he wanted it to go by the sea because that was going to be a sort of spectacular view, and it
Right,
is a fantastic view, but it has been prone to occasionally flooding, and then sort of just part of just we sort of get cut off for like
right,
a bit. They built a slightly bigger flood wall now, um,
right,
and it is a like it is hard to like I do it a relatively large amount, so it sort of maybe loses a bit of the kind of wow, it's just the sea one side of the train,
right.
um, but it is a cool uh, it is a cool view. I remember when I was younger. So my dad actually worked on the trains, which meant which in the UK, for some reason, anyone who works sort of on or near a train seems to get, I don't know if they still do it, a sort of discount card, which um you sort of get 16 days free travel or something for
Okay.
yourself,
Yep.
maybe 21 day or something for yourself and your spouse and I think any dependents you have. And it also had some sort of thing where he could get discounted travel in other countries and on their train networks. I guess it was some
Yeah.
kind of reciprocal thing. Um, and so for the sort of big holiday we did as kids, it obviously involved trains to sort of use this great discount. Um, and so we got the train to Paris, I think. Yeah, we got the train to. Oh no, I think we got the train to Rome and then came back and did Paris on the way back.
All right.
We did
Yeah.
the sleeper train through the Alps overnight. And just the memory of doing that is one of those where it was. I must have been like 7, so I can't. So my memories of it aren't particularly rich, but it does have this sort of romantic element to it of sort of having this thing of being half asleep going through the Alps and that
Yeah.
being sort of amazing experience. And I think I've sort of managed to recreate it kind of once. Me and my partner did. We flew to Seattle and did the train that goes down the coast
Oh,
to
right.
um
Yeah.
we actually went to San Francisco, I think, and then got a coach the last bit, which is about
Yes,
it.
there some of those scenic trains are still in existence in the US and Canada. As long as you're not in a hurry,
Mm,
they can be very nice. The
yeah,
one through Canada is horrendously expensive, but
this one
there's
was
some of the Americans is
yeah,
not
this
so
one was
bad.
sort of okay. I think it
Yeah.
had lots of tiers, but the bottom one was like fine. We had a chair
Yeah.
and a good view. But it was that there was sort of one a day. So any place we stopped, we sort of got off at 3:30, had a day or two there, and then you got back on at 3:30. The same time, which meant you couldn't really maximize the time you had in a certain place because if you got off in at 10 in the morning, you were going to have to
Right.
get back on and spend the day. But
Yeah.
but it wasn't a bad way to spend days, sort of going through the Rockies. I don't know if it's the Rockies. Some sort of
Yeah.
some foresty hills we went through, which were quite exciting because the train had to sort of do this up
Oh,
some
right.
hills.
Yeah, the switchbacks and everything. Yeah. In Europe, they tend to have the tunnels, especially in Switzerland, so that they
Mm,
don't do the switchbacks anymore. You're just into a tunnel.
yeah.
And sometimes you're in a very, very long tunnel. You know, the thing is with trains is that the travel can be really, really enjoyable. Like the train
Mm,
itself can be part of the vacation. And I think that's something I feel is lost when traveling by car or by airplane, where the travel is kind of just a pain in the ass and you just want to get it over with as fast as possible. And I always found that kind of frustrating when people talk about, oh well, it's this many hours to fly and this many more hours to take the train, so of course I'm going to fly. I'm like, yeah, but flying sucks and taking the train doesn't. So
mm,
and even then, sometimes when you add in getting to the airport early and all that other stuff, it's not even slower on the airplane. But even if it is slower on the train, it's more enjoyable. It's just a nice way to travel. And I think people that haven't experienced good trains, they don't get that. They've never experienced the idea that getting somewhere can be as enjoyable as getting there, like being there,
mm.
it's a totally different way of looking at transportation. And yes, I'm very much in favor of more trains. The more trains the better.
There's something about like the sort of gentle like rumble of that's kind of just soothing in a way.
I
And
tell you, good trains are great. Yeah, well, so right before we had kids, actually, my wife was literally pregnant with our first child. We took the train from Moscow to Beijing, through Mongolia and
wow.
through Russia, and it was 5.5 days, and it was just phenomenal. Like you see
Mm,
all of Russia and Mongolia, and you go into China, and it's phenomenal the things you see, because also the things you see aren't the things that you would normally see on a trip to any of those countries, right?
mm.
Especially going in China, where you stop in some city you've never heard of that has 2 million people, and the and the smog is so thick you could cut it with a knife. But But the thing was, after that train ride, 5.5 days, we loved it. There was the restaurant car, and it changed when you went into a new country. So it had Russian food, and then it had Mongolian food, and then it had Chinese food. It was just so interesting talking with the other passengers, and we could sit and read, and of course then you sleep on the train as well. We had a private bathroom, and it was just so nice that when the 5.5 days were up, we're like, we didn't want it to end. We're like, that's it, it's done already. Like, it was fantastic, and
It's like, oh,
I
now we've
can't
got to be in
imagine any
Beijing.
other way of getting around that. That I would be like after 5.5 days of it. I mean, 5.5 days on an airplane, I'd be ready to kill somebody.
I did have when we did the American trip, we did have the added bonus of one of the legs. There was a national park ranger on the train who just sort of did a kind of tour thing of just going like,
Nice.
this is this lake, this is its history, and like that was, which we didn't know was going to happen
Right.
until I wandered down to the bar car and was like, oh, this is cool. I was like, come on down. We've got this sort of free, and that was
I
one of those amazing
Yeah.
cars where they've sort of made windows in the top as well. And
Right.
I want that in the UK. I want. We've not got sort of mountains in quite the same way, maybe for many of our.
But the British countryside can be quite nice as long as it's not too close to a motorway. You know,
Yeah,
it can be quite nice. People go up to the Lake District and the Peak District, and you know, the Scottish Highlands they're stunning as well.
yeah. They'd be good from a train.
Yeah.
It is you keep going back to this thing of like the expansion of people being. I was just thinking about how there will be people who will be very excited for a good sort of 15-20 minutes of train content,
Yeah.
which
I was
does.
thinking the same thing. We will talk about trains forever if you let me, right? So like, well, maybe we should talk about something else because you know, I know it's not just bikes, but it's not just trains either. So there.
um but like that is like there is a whole move like I will, if I mention trains in a video, I will get a kind of trains, just people writing the word trains as sort of entire that's the entire
That's the comment.
comment. That's
Capital
the
letters, trains.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
that's the whole thing. That's a thing you can be a fan of now. Like, which I guess it always has been, but now it's sort of, I dare to say it's kind of it's cool. Like previously, being being a fan of a train was maybe not the 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 in thing.
Yeah, the term that was used for them and it's still used is the people who like go and look at trains and watch trains are called foamers. Like they're foaming at the mouth. They're like,
Okay.
which has a rabies connotation to it, right?
Yeah.
That they're these rabid foamers who are obsessed with trains. You know, I think actually it's a little bit sad, but I think part of the reason for this uptick in interest in urban planning and better and walkable cities also comes from the fact that younger people are just too poor to afford cars.
Yeah.
And I honestly think that's an element because when I see discussions in in forums and subreddits where there are younger people talking about their work and
Mm,
about their pay and about the problems that they're finding in the world, it very often comes up, especially with Americans. They'll say, like, you know, I'd be so much better off if I didn't need this car. And
mm,
I think that's a big cultural shift because if you look at boomers were really steeped in car culture, like
mm.
really, really steeped. You look at their movies, their TV shows, their music. I mean, if you listen to anything by the Beach Boys, half their music's about cars. You know, if it's not about surfing in California, it's about the car they're driving.
Yeah.
And when you look at all of the 1950s and 60s type stuff that was on TV and in media, it's all the cars.
Yeah.
And so the boomers
Grease
are
lightning.
really all about the cars. And I would say they've even been exposed to extreme levels of propaganda about cars.
Mm,
And I think that certainly continued. I'm a Gen Xer. That continued through that, you know, that cars were a thing. The SUVs, when I was researching about the history of SUVs, again reminding myself of some of that because I had read High and Mighty back in 2002, a book by a Detroit auto journalist about the rise of SUVs, which is one of the things that helped radicalize me. But I remember, like, one of the things I was reminded of is that one of my favorite movies, Back to the Future, in that film, Marty just cannot, like, he sees this Toyota pickup truck, right? And he just
Mm.
really wants this Toyota pickup truck so badly. And it's actually like a core part of the story. And at the end, when the past gets changed and the future becomes perfect, he owns that pickup truck now. And that
Mm.
again, it's like there were these things that I didn't even wasn't even consciously aware of at the time, but there was so much of that car culture that went through my childhood and the media that I consumed.
And an
And I
idea of kind of success. I don't know if it's a Thatcher quote or if it's someone, sort of member of her cabinet that said that if you're, I think, like, if a young man's still catching the bus at the age of 25, he should consider himself a failure. Like, the idea
yeah,
that if you've not that's it's independence, and it's also a kind of, um, that's you being your own person in the world, being a kind of proper individual rather than relying on, this vehicle that is being provided to you that
by the
you're
state, yes.
yeah.
I'm surprised you were able to mention she who shall not be named without a lightning bolt coming down and striking us both. So maybe we won't say the T word anymore in this discussion, but
I should
yes, she was just like Reagan, and in Canada there was a fellow called Brian Mulrooney who was similar, that just neoliberal capitalism. Oh Jesus Christ, those people. But yes, there was definitely this overarching message that public transit is for poor people, desperate people. Why would you be doing that? And that stigma absolutely existed in my hometown. um, I remember I was actually just somebody had just sent me a clip of a previous podcast I had done because it came up in conversation. I had totally forgotten about it. I went back and listened to it with Chuck from Strongtowns, and we were talking about public transportation and the way people feel about it. And when I was growing up as a teenager, like, I was living in this suburb that was, for a teenager especially, boring as hell. There was basically nothing within walking distance. And so my friends and I would sometimes go downtown, but to do that, we had to go wait for a bus. And the bus that was scheduled to come every 45 minutes, but of course it didn't. It usually would come 45 minutes late, and two of them would come at once. The bus sucked. And I remember when I turned 16 and I finally got my driver's license, I was like, oh, yes, finally, I'm free.
Mm.
And I mentioned in one of my videos, the first thing I did was I drove to Wendy's and bought a hamburger. Like, that was, oh my God, I'm 16. I can buy my own hamburger. Like, it's so pathetic thinking back on it in retrospect, to be honest. It's absolutely pathetic. But the thing was, the bus was seen, and I think still is seen today in my hometown, um, as something that uh, you really only take if you're poor or desperate. And that sounds terrible, but that's simply the way that people look at it. And the reason for that is, I think, it's just an inferior mode of transport. But it doesn't have to be an inferior mode of transport. It's just been made that way, right?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
So it gets stuck in the same traffic as the cars, as I've talked about hundreds of times before. So yeah, when your buses are infrequent and unreliable, and they're old clunkers that are, like, belching out black smoke, and they're stuck in traffic, and, like, of course you're not going to take the bus if you can afford a car.
Mm.
Um, but I feel like that's a self-fulfilling prophecy by making public transit so inferior.
And
Um,
in making it not be something that's used enough that it means that the smaller routes have to be cancelled because not enough
yes,
people get them, and it
yes,
does sort of spiral, doesn't it? Because um, because you don't you because if it's not bringing in enough money to run that route, then you can't run that
right,
route, and therefore no one's using it. So someone else gets a car because it's not a viable option anymore. Which I think we struggle with in the UK, where it means that both routes get cancelled, but also then fares have to go up because
yep.
less people have to pay for more of the bus running, I guess.
And that is your death spiral of public transit, and we're seeing it happen all over the world, especially after COVID, where there was a drop in ridership and therefore
Mm,
income. Even Amsterdam's talking about cutting back some of the frequencies on some of the tram and bus routes, which is really sad. But I think it also goes back to those people who shall not be named that we talked about from the '80s, who really looked at at bringing the market into everything, right? It was all about the free market, private ownership. You've talked about this in your videos. You talked about it with your energy stuff too, but it happened with public transportation as well. This idea that the private companies will run public transportation better, and they'll create competition within the system, and that will create better service for everyone at a lower cost. And that has been proven to be completely and totally wrong in almost all cases, with very few exceptions. If you look at, for instance, Japan, where the public transit, the train companies actually make most of their money off of real estate. Hong Kong is the same kind of thing.
Mm.
But privatization of these public transportation has been a horrible failure in almost every place it's ever been attempted, and certainly you've seen it in the UK. And I think it does happen that some of these routes, they're not bringing in enough money, and so then they're cut, and then that starts that spiral. But I think we have to back up a little bit here and say, like, well, does it need to bring in that much money? Do all of these routes need to be profitable, or is there an overall societal benefit to
Yeah.
having good quality transit? Because otherwise, like, if you look at the small town that you say you grew up in, and you see these all over the place where public transit's been cut back to one bus a day or something like that. I mean, if that bus were running every half hour, say, throughout most of the daylight hours, there would be more people taking it. There are
Mm.
almost certainly, when those buses are cut back, there are almost certainly people who went to driving, whether they
Yeah.
went and bought a car, or whether they bought a second car, or whether they started driving when they could have taken public transit, or whatever it might be. And what are the implications of that when you suddenly have hundreds of these little towns where everybody is now driving and basically nobody's taking public transportation anymore? What are the impacts of society of that? And we also then start to get these where we're trying to reduce the number of automobiles in cities, but then all of the people who live in the peripheral towns say, "Well, I have to drive in. I have no other choice." And then that becomes a factor that pushes back against making the cities better. And then we end up with all these problems with too many cars in the cities and all of the negative things that happen from that. And a lot of that just stems from the fact that we went and said, all the public transit needs to be profitable. All the public transit needs to, every route needs to bring in money, and otherwise it gets cut. And,
Yeah.
and I think as a society, we're paying the price for that kind of short-sighted vision for public transit. And
Because
it's particularly frustrating, of course, when the roads are subsidized like crazy.
because there is a social good to people being like I what one thing I think of is, in that village that I grew up in, the population sort of leaned older,
Right.
and there was probably either, well, there's certainly older people who either were then kind of just cut off, and maybe probably had good social networks within the village itself, but suddenly couldn't go into the slightly bigger town, or go
Right.
to the village over, or to the town after that, to um go to the slightly bigger supermarket themselves, or to um go to the slightly bigger WI group, or whatever their particular um you know play tennis or whatever at something that we didn't have in the village, or stays driving slightly longer than um
Mm, yeah,
uh
then it's probably safe.
probably a great idea, because they kind of, that's their only way to go and see their mate Fred, who lives somewhere where the bus could have taken them.
Yeah.
um but it's interesting that you brought up the kind of opposite end of that, of younger people who, for whom car ownership is actually, who are rethinking things because car ownership is maybe not affordable, or at least not a sensible uh financial decision to make. Like, I don't think
Yeah.
I've necessarily thought of it myself in quite that way, but I think that's probably where my sort of relationship, I think, like I said earlier, we've got a car that my partner uses to get to work. From my point of view, it's I need to do something in particular where I need to transport something, or we have to go somewhere where a train can't take us, or it's just too expensive because UK trains are really
Yeah.
expensive and we need to get four of us somewhere or something. And so, like, my approach to sort of our car is this is a very specific thing that is like a tool that I use on particular occasions. And I think that
Right.
is just from having had, I sort of learned to drive when I was 17, and then drove my mum's car for a bit after that, but then just sort of didn't have a car for a decade because it was never quite affordable, or never quite seemed like the trade-off, like spending however much on the car and
Yeah.
insurance and all of that never quite
Yeah.
made sense for the sort of benefits I was going to get out of it. So it
Right.
does mean that I didn't have that kind of the James Dean film kind of thing of like getting the car when you're 17,
Yeah,
and
exactly, right?
which sort of growing up rurally, like I one of my brother's friends at the time, his life revolved around his car. That was, in very much that same way, that was everything. It was getting the big
Yep.
speakers on the back,
Yep.
not to really drive anywhere in particular, I don't think, but just to sort of drive around.
It
But
becomes part of your identity, right?
yeah, whereas, yeah, I think I imagine sort of my experience. I imagine lots of people who are now enthusiastically orange pilled members of Fuck Cars have maybe had a slightly different experience. So you sort of view it through a slightly different lens of, this is a tool I can use,
Yeah.
um, rather than something that is part of my I don't know, like, some people, when they budget, they have a car payment that is definitely something they would have to include, rather than a thing that is an option that you could have.
Yeah, I mean, I think ultimately that's what my channel is really about. It's about car dependency. Being dependent on a car is a bad thing, and it benefits absolutely nobody except the people who sell cars. Car dependency is horrible, and huge parts of the U.S. and Canada are car dependent. There's parts of Europe that are car dependent, but not in the same way that they are in North America. Because
Mm,
even a car dependent place in Europe, will still have a local high street or something like that, right? Like still be some services that are within walking distance, and there are at least some alternatives. A car may still be the fastest way to get around, but it's not car dependent. It's not like you literally can't feed yourself without getting in a car, and that is the situation in large parts of North America. And so you're basically burdening everyone in society with the cost of a car. And sometimes you need to have two cars. For example, if you have, two people in a household and they both work. And you also start to see it. I mean, I see it all over Canada where, the kids turn 16 and the kids need a car because
mm,
the parents are tired of driving them to high school every day. And it's absurd. It's absolutely absurd that you would need a car. I think needing a car is insane, and I think that we should push back against that in any way possible. I would love to see it that cars stop being cool. They stop being this like this status symbol that people are desperate to own, and they just become a tool. You know, like
mm.
like like I have a circular saw, and I use the circular saw when I need it to cut something, but I'm not using it for everything. You know,
You're not looking. You're not stood there just looking around, going
yeah,
like,
like what can I use
"What?"
this on? You know the phrase, yeah.
There's a
When
job for
when
the
all you have
circular.
is an SUV, everything looks like a drive, right? So yeah, there's actually a fellow in the UK who started a organization called Bike is Better, and they do public service announcement in the UK about how for short trips take a bike basically.
Mm,
But they have this really funny video where they show people like using tools for completely ridiculous things, like using a blowtorch to light a candle and things like that. And it's quite funny. And then at the end of the video of all these absurd things, they show a guy with a single jug of milk and he puts it in the back of his truck. And it's the same thing, right? Like
yeah,
why are you buying, if you need a single jug of milk, why would you do it in 2 tons of steel? It's absurd.
yeah.
And I think that's really it. And I think that cars are useful, as I said at the beginning of this, and we drive sometimes too. We don't own a car because we live in a place where owning a car would be a liability. It wouldn't be a benefit. Like it would be one more thing to worry about. We'd have to pay to insure it, and it's out on the street, and we need to make sure
Mm,
that it doesn't get scratched or broken into or whatever, and it really doesn't provide us any serious benefit. So we use a car share program. So those are share cars that are around the town, and there's lots of car share programs. And if I need a car, I can go get one. I can open an app and I can have a car within a couple of minutes, and that's fine. I rarely use a car,
Mm,
just because it's not necessary. And I would like I think that's the way that most people should be able to live. That it's an option,
mm.
but it sure as hell isn't a requirement.
And I think what I think what I find really interesting about your channel and some of the other channels that do a similar thing, and the kind of also the sort of broader movement that has come to exist around it, is the fact that I guess yes, there is a subreddit called Fuck Cars, and some of it is very is about being anti car, but there's not just a no, there is also lots of yeses, and I
Yeah,
feel like that I have learned a huge amount of like I can look at the city in which I live, and I can not only go, oh, I think that thing doesn't work. I can go, oh, I think this area should be pedestrianized, and I think
right,
that this and I'm like passionate about the things. Like it feels like there's lots of yeses in a really positive way. Um, we've recently got or I think it's just launching at the moment, a bike scheme. I think it is of like ones you pick up, and I think they're slightly too expensive, and I feel really passionate about I've got this thing where I'm really passionate about this scheme existing, and I think it should
right.
exist and be good. I think there's a problem with it that I think needs to be worked out, but it feels like a really kind of positive thing rather than um just a negative, which I think is what makes it kind of really exciting for me. Do you
Right.
see that as well, or do you just see
I
the
do, although I can be plenty negative at times because I do get angry at this stuff.
mm,
You know what's interesting though? Even fuck cars is actually quite a positive subreddit, and in many ways, I
mm,
would say they're often more positive. Like they do lots of memey stuff, and that's they love it,
mm,
and that's great. But they can actually be even more positive than my content I find over on fuck cars. And I actually think that the name fuck cars is a little bit deceiving, but at the same time, we wouldn't be talking about it right now if it were called N car dependency,
yeah,
right?
yeah,
Like nobody would care. The
the
fuck cars gets the name because I think the thing is there are a lot of people that are waking up to this, outside of my channel, outside of being orange pilled. There are people who are waking up to this where they have been steeped in auto industry propaganda their entire lives. And to say that a car is a necessity and it's something that you should strive for and it's something that as soon as you get your license you will want to do this, and then when they see something like fuck cars, they're like, huh, what? What are you talking about? Like, are
mm,
you crazy? But then it causes them to sort of look at it and go, you know what? Now that you mention it, there are all these negatives that come along with this as well. And I think that does catch people's attention. Um, so yes, there is a positive angle to it as well, but there's definitely going to be a lot of negativity because, as I said, I feel like we got too excited about this new technology when the automobile came along, and I feel like we went all in on it, and we really do need to bring it back. And I think that that's going to be a difficult thing for a lot of reasons. It's difficult to change the status quo, period, especially when it's entrenched with a lot of you know fossil fuel industry interests, automobile industry interests, and lots of all the things that stretch out from those industries too. So it's
mm,
going to be a tough thing to claw back, but I think ultimately it's going to be better for everyone to claw it back. And I
mm,
think when it comes to cars, again, I really want to see it used as a tool in the toolbox, not to be the only thing that we have at our disposal. And I want us to look at this and say, like, what do you really need cars for? Because that's one of the other things that's really frustrated me about this conversation as I've orange pilled myself on this, coming from car dependent suburbia and thinking that, for example, when I lived without a car through university, I would have people telling me, "Oh yeah, yeah, but when you get a real job, you're going to want a car." And then I got a real job and I took the streetcar there. But then people would say, "Yeah, but when you have kids, you're going to want a car. You're going to need a car when you have kids." But then we had kids, and actually, it was perfectly fine. We could walk to the school. We could take the kid on a bike. And not only was it possible, it was actually better because we
mm,
did live, for example, when we lived in Belgium, because of where my wife and I worked, we needed to own a car. And actually, it was the only time in our entire lives that we owned two cars because we both needed to drive to work, and that was in Brussels. And it actually kind of sucked to take the kids to school in a car. It was much less comfortable. The kids are strapped into these car seats. And comparing that to taking the kids like we've done here in a cargo bike, night and day. cargo bike is 1,000 times better for kids.
Mm.
And so again, it's like there's these compounding lies that I've been told my whole life that, if you were disabled, you will need to have a car. A very common one that we hear all the time. And yet here in Amsterdam, I see disabled people on tricycles and mobility scooters. I see them all the time. Every single day, I see a disabled person out, and they are getting around just fine. And I hear constantly from people who watch my channel who are physically disabled who will say to me, I can't drive a car because of my disability. I'm not allowed to get a driver's license, or I am not physically able to drive a car, or whatever. There's a huge percentage of the disabled population who can't drive. And yet people are out there saying, nope, we need to keep the cars because it's disabled people. And those people are just totally being ignored. Those people who are disabled and can't drive aren't being heard. Same thing with seniors. Seniors need cars to get around. But again, I see people in their 80s and 90s here cycling or on tricycles or on mobility scooters or on public transit. And it's serving these people very well. And I think this is really what we have to do. We have to start using cars as a tool when necessary and when they are useful, and reducing the societal costs to those, because having everybody in a car is a bad thing. We've seen it in the United States. It's terrible. We don't want to go down that road. But let's also be honest with ourselves, like, use a car when it's really necessary. Have cars when they're really necessary.
Well,
anyway.
What a way to round us off.
I think that's it, right?
That was a really good final stump speech for the episode, I think. For the kind of two people listening who are like, wait, not just what? Sorry, what? Who's this? Who's this guy?
For anybody who hasn't seen it yet, Not Just Bikes. If you search for Not Just Bikes, you'll find it. It's mostly on YouTube, but I've stretched out. I have started a podcast actually called The Urbanist Agenda, where I'm talking with other urbanists about all the things that we're talk about, but haven't turned into videos yet. And so hopefully that seems to be actually taking off quite well. It's just the first couple episodes. Episode 3 is coming out soon with RM Transit, and that's been great.
I'm looking forward to checking that out, because I think it's gonna be interesting to hear lots of creators that sort of create things separately, sort of find the things that you agree on and the things that maybe you don't, and the ways your experiences overlap. I'm sure it's going to be fascinating.
Yeah, and the things that we learn from each other too, because like, for example, I was the second episode I was talking with Alan Fisher from the YouTube channel Alan Fisher about micromobility, and these electric scooters and one wheels and all these other things that you see around, and most of those things are illegal in the Netherlands, and I've never ridden them at all. And so it was fascinating to hear from Alan, who not only has ridden these things, he used to make his own electric longboards when he was in university. And he even worked for an electric scooter company, one of those rental scooters that use with an app. And so it was fascinating to hear from him about that experience and where he sees them fitting in, and what it's like in Philadelphia, where he lives now, about when people use them and how they combine them with public transit. And it's actually really, really interesting. I learned a lot.
Oh, great. And that's the Urbanist Agenda.
The Urbanist Agenda, yep.
Cool. Well, thank you so much for joining me, Jason. I was going to do a round of applause, but it's just me, so that will be very sad. Hopefully at some point I'll get good at hosting podcasts, not trying to do a round of applause with an audience who's not going to listen for a couple of weeks' time. But thank you so much for joining me, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your evening.
Yeah, thanks so much, Tom. It was great.
Thank you so much for listening to my chat with Jason from Not Just Bikes. I hope you found it interesting and enjoyable in some way. As I mentioned during the show, if you want to be among the first to get access to new episodes of Induction as they come out, then you can do so by signing up to my premium streaming service, Nebula. To get the best deal on Nebula while supporting us to make more episodes like this one, you can head to go.nebula.tv/induction. Thank you so much again for listening, and I'll catch you in the next episode of the show.